This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.
I'm Tom Hoppe, and I'm your host of the Most Painful Podcast. In the last episode, we spoke to Jason Bussa, who completed a research comparing opioids to cannabis and their effects on chronic pain. Some very interesting information that came from this study. And I'd also like to thank everyone who provided feedback and enjoyed the episode on yoga and chronic pain with Neil Pearson. It was well received. If you missed any of these episodes, you can listen to them on our Spotify or Apple feed. With many operations overseas, people may have heard about traumatic brain injury caused by roadside blast. But what is a TBI and how does it impact a person? Is a TBI the same as a concussion? To talk to us about this today, we're joined by Lyn Turkstra, who is a professor at McMaster's for the School of Rehab Science, and she's conducting a research about TBI and concussion in veterans. Lyn, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Tom.
So, Lyn, let's start off. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the research project and TBI and concussions. And is there a difference between the two, or are they the same? Or
I think that's a good place to start with what is TBI and what's the difference between TBI and concussion. So I would say the most widely accepted definition of traumatic brain injury now is that it's damage to the brain from applied force. And that force can be a blow to the head or to the body that shakes the head and communicates that force to the brain. A concussion is a mild traumatic brain injury. They're actually synonymous. But concussions were discussed, I think, early on in sports and sort of seen as something that was minor, that you could live with, you could have a few. And so in some ways, the concussion idea and research and everything about it has developed separately from TBI, but it's really a mild TBI.
so you're saying like they've separated the two then, in a sense, right?
Yeah, I think kind of historically, it was like people in sports would talk about concussion. And then we had the Operation Iraqi Freedom and Enduring Freedom in the US, and then started to see, thousands of active duty soldiers coming back with brain damage. And I think that was probably one of the times people realized, oh, this is not just a trivial thing to have a concussion. It actually can be life-changing.
So now, are you saying that they're merging the two now, TBI and concussion, or is it still a separate discussion?
No, it's the same discussion, but I think out in the general public, you'll still hear people think of them as not the same thing, but I think in the brain world, the brain injury world, people are merging the terms. I mean, there's more severe injuries that aren't concussions, so I don't mean to say they're synonymous terms.
So what is your research looking at then?
We are doing a study of cognitive rehabilitation for veterans in Canada, RCMP and CAF veterans who've had mild brain injury somewhere in their history.
So this would be recorded percussions or in that sense. Now, I know in the military too, and we kind of talked a little bit offline on this, but there's, we used to call it, you get your can kind of rattled when you're on the range using Carl Gustav anti-tank weapons or because of the concussion blasts that are caused by it. Is that a form of a TBI, or is that just completely something different?
It is not something different. So this is physics. So anything that you're exposed to that applies force to the brain can potentially cause brain damage and lasting brain damage in some cases. We've talked to lots. I've been working with the US military for about 25 years, and we've talked to lots of people who never had anything diagnosed as a concussion. It was just in training. They were using shoulder-mounted equipment, like you talked about, the rocket launcher, or they were parachute jumpers, or they were over the side of a boat, or they were engaging in something I didn't realize was a Canadian tradition, pugilism, outside of taking physical risks during training in active duty. So, yeah.
So can we talk a little bit maybe about the physiology of the brain when it has an injury and what it goes through? I mean, because from some of the literature I've been reading, the brain can repair itself, neuroplasticity and all that. So maybe you can touch a little bit on that and kind of give people an idea of an injury to the brain and is there hope for recovery?
So first of all, there's always hope for recovery. So those of us who work, so I'm a trained speech language pathologist, and those of us who work in brain injury rehab, we define recovery as people improving over time. I think some people define recovery as being exactly the same as I was before this happened. And sometimes that's puts us at odds with people. So the brain is plastic. There's always room for people to change. Thank goodness.
Mm-hmm.
Or else, really, Tom, you and I could skip having the podcast because nobody's thinking would ever change after listening to it. So I think neuroplasticity has become kind of a buzzword. So yes, of course, the brain can continue to change, but there are upper limits on that. So if you take out a percentage of neurons in the brain, we don't really, for all intents and purposes, grow new ones.
Mm-hmm.
And so when people have damage to the brain, then some thinking processes might be different. And in the pain community, what we've talked about is how if you have pain and you're managing it, it's taking away some of the mental resources you have for thinking. So even if it's not physical damage to the brain, you also can have sort of functional, I would say, like functional disruption to the brain, because so much of your thinking is focused on managing your pain. You don't have a lot of extra thinking to remember where your keys are.
So if somebody has, like we know a lot of veterans have low back pain or they have neck pain. And so if they're managing that, they're active, they're doing their daily thing, but they're managing through that. You're saying that now is taking energy, I guess, in a sense, or away from the brain then.
Right? It's taking mental energy. So I think there's two things operating. You mentioned like what are the physiological steps that are involved in brain damage. So there's definitely, when people have force applied to the brain, there's disruption of connections in the brain. There's changes in how brain chemicals function, so neurotransmitters in the brain. So there are physiological changes that have to do with brain injury. And depending on the person and the injury and a lot of other health factors, that may recover and the person might be fine after a mild injury. A person could recover and be fine after, or some people don't recover. So there's that sort of physiological or physical damage. But then, as I was saying, in the pain, in our people who have both brain injury and pain, or like history of concussions and pain, they may have even fewer mental resources to apply to a task. And it's not necessarily because they had physiological damage from the concussions. It's because they maybe had a tiny bit of physiological damage, but then they have like 10% of their thinking capacity is just trying to ignore low back pain.
Right.
And so in our study, we're very focused on people's everyday lives and what are the challenges they have. We're not focused on proving that someone had an injury or didn't have an injury. If a person had a history and it's consistent with, some applied force to the brain and they're struggling in everyday life, that's what counts.
And then, so what I hear you saying is that struggle, are you trying to separate then, is that if someone has pain and they've had a history of concussion, is that struggle linked to the concussion or is it linked to the pain and the concussion, or either or, right? So is that what you're trying to determine in the study in a sense?
Well, we actually don't, we're not trying to determine which of those it is. All we're trying to determine is what can we do to help that person be successful in their everyday life. A lot of people who have milder injuries have really been through a lot of assessments trying to quote unquote prove that they had a brain injury. And that is not our job. So that is not our mission. We really want to find ways to help people learn strategies that support them every day so that they can do their job and have a social life and not be at odds with their family and mentally exhausted
Right.
all the time. So we're actually the opposite of that. We're not trying to determine what the real problem is.
So I'd like to get back to that, but just to unpack some stuff about a concussion, because I was doing some reading. I mean, there's like mild concussions and then there's severe concussions. And so when we talk about, someone gets hit on the head. I mean, I've been hit on the head with a tailgate from, in the military, that kind of thing. And you feel woozy, and then or you're playing sports and you get hit in the head, you feel woozy. Would that be kind of a minor concussion, or how is this? I mean, I guess the question is, a concussion will repair itself, will it not? Or is that, it doesn't matter if it's mild or severe, if there's a blow to the brain, that is considered damage that's non-repairable. Is that a correct statement, or is that not correct?
I would say that's not correct in terms of damage that's not repairable. So I think right now we don't know why for some people, we could take two people who have the same hit on the head, that two people like a tailgate, I think you said from your
Yeah.
story. So
Yeah.
you have two people who are hit by a tailgate, and you would think, like, G-force wise, they both have the same gravitational force applied to the brain.
Yeah.
But one person seems to have been fine after 30 minutes, and another person a year later is still having symptoms. We don't really understand what that difference is. So I think that the classification of mild, moderate, severe concussion is actually going to go away, to be honest. I think that people are just going to be talking about, this was a brain injury, and it's somewhere on the spectrum of severity of a brain injury. And at the very mildest end, it's a transient disruption in brain function. And then if there's more gravitational force, also maybe some other risk factors. So for example, maybe you have a person who has an older brain, so it moves around more with the same gravity. Or maybe you have someone who has vascular problems, has a history of stroke, or,
Mm-hmm.
so there's all kinds of lifestyle things. And then maybe someone has the genetics to be able to tolerate getting bonked by something, but then you have somebody else who doesn't. You know what I mean? So it's what's mild is what's mild to you. So at the extreme end, when someone is in a motor vehicle accident and they're in a coma, obviously that's a more severe injury. But in this mild end, the new definition there's a new criteria for mild TBI. New criteria were released in the spring of this year. And they basically say when it's a physiologically probable event associated with some neurological disruption. So you mentioned like feeling nauseated or having a brief lapse of memory or confusion at the time of the event. People have light sensitivity afterward, or having tunnel vision, or having some other kinds of bad headaches. That's the criteria now for the mildest kind of brain injury. And again, people will recover from that and be fine. In fact, 90% of people will recover, within a few days. And then even more people will recover within a couple of weeks. But for some reason, there's a small percentage of people who still have problems, who are better, but not all better.
Right. And then is there, I guess, long term, even if a person's recovered? So what I'm understanding is that means the brain's kind of healed itself, and you move on in life. Where really the only way is if someone is still struggling, like with light sensitivity, or they're still nauseous, or they're having dizzy spells, then that says that it probably hasn't recovered fully from that jolt. Yeah.
And I would say most of the time, those are not the long-lasting things. I think the somatic or body symptoms are, other than headaches, are not the most long-lasting. I would say it's cognitive. It's the cognitive challenges that people are still feeling a little bit, like one service member said, like, my brain is in molasses. Just not being able to multitask as effectively as before, not being able to think as fast
Mm-hmm.
as before, not really being able to tolerate like a multi-person conversation, or people sort of throwing a lot of instructions at them, or thinking quickly and sharply when they're a little bit tired, which they used to be able to push through. And now finding that they're not able to just sort of keep it all together.
And what about age? I mean, as we age, do we not, when we start hitting our 60s or 50s, does things not slow down naturally? So how
Tom,
does
don't
one?
say that. Don't say that about 60s. I don't want to hear it, because I'm
I'm
in
close.
them.
I'm close myself, and I think the only reason I survived concussions, I got a thick skull. But is there not that part of it as well too? And how do you differentiate? Is it possible that somebody could have had, say, a TBI in service or a concussion in service, and later on in life have symptoms? Or is it really early on and then it's healed and you move on, and then the rest of your life is maybe just aging, that you're starting to lose where your keys are and stuff like that? But
So there is some evidence that having had early brain injury, even mild brain injury, increases the risk of having dementia. It's not clear how much injury. Again, it's the same thing. We're not good enough at it to be able to say, oh, look, you had 3 concussions. That means you're going to get Alzheimer's when you're 60. But it does increase the risk of having dementia later on. And I think it might be similar to something that from early in the 20th century, post-polio syndrome, where people seemed to recover from polio, but then as they had a normal loss of motor fibers, basically, or motor neurons with age, they started to show polio symptoms. So it was really that we have such capacity for brain function, and as you said, such plasticity, that we can manage with perhaps not the perfect brain we had. We can manage for a really long time, but then we age, and then the the symptoms they reemerge. I think that's possible. We don't have very good data on that, though. There's not a lot of research in general on older people with brain injury histories. You can imagine, because the awareness is fairly recent.
Yeah.
So we're talking about needing to follow someone for 40 years. I don't think anybody's been studying it 40 years yet.
Yeah. So there's no longitudinal study out there to show that. That.
Not that long.
Oh. So just to lighten up the conversation a little bit, what are some things? I mean, we hear about brain health and nutrition, and I'm just reading that book from Peter Attia on exercising and circulation, and are those all things that can, has a literature shown that these are things that can help? And in your experience working with patients, are these things that can actually help and reduce longer term effects, the early onset of dementia, Alzheimer's, those kind of things, if people are concerned about that?
So I think that the strongest evidence we have is that staying physically active and socially active are really good for your brain. Not so much computer games. So, but I think just being social and, doing things that are personally meaningful and stimulating to you, and getting exercise. Those are just really, really good things for your brain. I wanted to mention something, if I could hijack a minute.
Yeah.
I was listening to your podcast, The Mission First, Self Last, with Melanie Noel and Hélène Soler.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, I think that we have gone about our research study the wrong way from the beginning. It's people everywhere talk about how it's hard to get military members to get help because of the, mission first, self last sort of a mentality. And so I think, getting exercise and staying socially active, I think those are really, really important. But the other thing I would say, since I have an opportunity, is that there is help. There are things that we can do to help when a person has these long-term cognitive problems. And I think we thought that veterans would know that and would just sign up and want help. But I think there's sort of a I'll tough it out mentality, right? I'm tough. I can have all these concussions and I'm fine. And I don't know what your thoughts are about that, Tom, but
Yeah, well, and this is actually part of why we did the podcast, because part of that, from our experience and from the work I've done, is it's also awareness and education. So, we talk about chronic pain, and that there's actually a very low understanding of chronic pain in the veterans community, and myself included. And I would suggest the same is probably with concussions, because it's just, you just shrug it off and you move on.
right.
And until something happens. So yeah, that's part of it. And then of course, dealing with the mindset and identity piece, moving from, very directive culture into an independent culture, it ties in. And that, yeah, and I agree with you. If a research is being done, then it is helpful to kind of do it through the lens of the military versus a civilian lens, which kind of may help understand why you may not be getting a lot of people signing up for it, so.
And we're working with the Atlas Institute for Veterans and Families. We have military advisors on the part. It's not that. It was more, as I said, taking this opportunity to help raise awareness
That's key.
that
Yeah.
being tough is good, but it's also possible that you don't have to, that there are better ways to do things, that you don't have to feel like, we just talk to a lot of people who feel like they have to keep this mask of, everything's fine and
Yeah.
I don't need any help. And so I think that's also healthy. So along with exercising and socializing and doing all these things and eating well to protect your brain and staying off the computer, except for listening to podcasts, I think it's also good to recognize that, your brain is a really critical organ, and there's things that you can do every day to help you function more effectively.
And that's key. I think like you said, the awareness is key, the education is key, and learning about what one can do, because I think it could be, with chronic pain, and that's why we use the word, keep the hope alive, because there is sometimes people feel they've lost hope. And I would also suggest that, maybe people also feel when it comes to a brain injury, that's kind of scary, because we've probably seen people in our families or other people on what can happen with if you have a brain injury. So perhaps there's also the fear of facing that or
Maybe.
addressing it too. And that could all come through knowledge and education and that kind of thing. So, yeah. So, I mean, we talk about diet, we talk about exercise. Is there anything else that you could add in there that, from your experience that would give people hope and that would help them?
Well, I think, as I said, the sort of socializing, staying connected, there's good data on aging effects that socialization really, just talking with other people, having interactions with other people is really beneficial for your brain health as well, obviously, as your mental health. So I think that would be a good take home strategy.
Awesome. Well, this has been great, Lyn. I mean, I probably could talk longer. And I say that at the end of every show. I'm sure people are tired of hearing it, but it is true because we bring on these experts and you guys have so much knowledge and there is a thirst for knowledge. So it's been great to have you on and it was an interesting discussion. So thanks for being on the show.
Thank you very much for having me, Tom.
And for our audience, the next show we're going to talk about is going to be osteoarthritis. Dr. Eugene Maddock from the DeGroote Pain Clinic, and that's going to be the next episode, so stay tuned for that. For feedback about the show or more information on chronic pain, you can visit our website at veteranschronicpain.ca. Or you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Chronic Pain COE and on Instagram at chronicpain_COE. So once again, Lyn, thanks for being on the show. And to everybody else, keep the hope alive. And we'll talk to you on the next episode.
The Most Painful Podcast
is produced for the Chronic Pain Center of Excellence by Story Studio Network and Eye Contact Productions.